Welcome to the Interval 0 RTX64 debugging overview video. In this video, we'll show how RTX64 integrates with Visual Studio, we'll discuss local and remote debugging options, and we'll also provide an overview of how you can achieve a remote debug connection. The RTX64 SDK integrates seamlessly with the Microsoft Visual Studio IDE to provide a powerful and familiar development and debugging environment. When you install the RTX64 SDK, you can choose to install Visual Studio support for creating RTSS applications and RTDLLs, as well as build and debug support for one or more supported versions of Microsoft Visual Studio. This installs V6 packages to this folder. For example, the RTX64 VS support.v6 package installs the Interval 0 real-time debugger and templates for creating RTSS applications and RTDLLs for Visual Studio 2019 and 2017. If you choose to install a supported Visual Studio version after you install the RTX64 SDK, you can run the corresponding RTX64 V6 package to install its functionality in Visual Studio without having to reinstall the RTX64 SDK in its entirety. RTX64 provides two project templates in the versions of Microsoft Visual Studio it supports. One each for creating a project and solution for the development of RTX64 applications and RTX64 real-time dynamic link libraries, known as RTDLLs. Select the template you want to use, provide a name, and click Create. For this video, we'll create an RTSS application. The RTX64 application template provides the structure for creating RTX64 applications. To accept the current settings, click Finish. Optionally, you can specify other libraries or options that you want to include in your RTX64 application project, such as support for the RTTCP/IP stack, real-time network abstraction layer, and RTX64 Vision. The template can also provide a basic C or C++ program framework with which to work. This program framework can include RTX64 program elements, which contain C or C++ code to create RTX64 objects and demonstrate their use. Here we have our new project source open in Visual Studio, and we've added some simple code. RTX64 provides a collection of code snippets for complex functions that can be inserted where you need them in your code. To insert a snippet, place your cursor where you want the code inserted and then right-click and select Snippet followed by Insert Snippet, or use Ctrl-K. Then select the Interval 0 snippet folder and the snippet you'd like to insert. RTX64 adds 4 build configurations in Visual Studio when you create a project using the RTX64 application template. Select the appropriate configuration to build a debug or release RTSS application. Using configurations, you can build a Windows and RTX64 version of an application without having to make any code changes. You build an RTSS application the same way you would build a Windows app. Here we'll select Build Solution from the Build menu. Next, we'll highlight breakpoint support and the RTX64 debugging options provided in both a local and remote debug environment. Breakpoints are useful when you know the line of code or the section of code that you want to examine in detail. RTX64 supports soft and hard-coded breakpoints as well as conditional breakpoints. To set a breakpoint in your source code, select the line of code and press F9. Or click in the far left margin next to a line of code and then right-click and select Breakpoint, Insert Breakpoint. The breakpoint appears as a red dot in the left margin. To set a breakpoint condition, hover over the breakpoint symbol, select the settings icon and then select Conditions in the breakpoint settings window, or right-click the breakpoint symbol and then select Conditions and add your condition. In this example, our conditional breakpoint will stop the debugger at loop number 5 of the 15 loops in our code. Conditional breakpoints appear as a red dot with a plus symbol. Hover over the conditional breakpoint to view details on the conditional expression. You can see here our code also contains a hard-coded debug break intrinsic. When the application is run inside the Visual Studio IDE, it will freeze at this breakpoint, as we will show in a moment. You can debug an RTSS process or RTDLL directly in Visual Studio. When you create an RTSS application with the RTX64 application template, interval 0 real-time debugger options are added to Visual Studio. The real-time debugger is automatically selected when the RTSS debug configuration of the project is selected. When you launch a real-time process from Visual Studio, you can debug within the IDE just as if it were a Windows process. If we start debugging our application, it will run until our first breakpoint, the conditional breakpoint, is hit. As expected, our conditional breakpoint breaks at loop number 5. If we continue debugging, our application will generate an exception triggered by the hard-coded breakpoint we added to our code at loop number 10. You can attach the Visual Studio debugger to any running RTSS process on the local machine using the Attach to RTSS process option in the Debug menu. This option opens the Attach to RTSS process dialog, which displays the name and process ID for each running RTSS process. You can hover the mouse over the process name to display its path in a tooltip. All processes to which you are currently attached or that are currently being debugged are grayed out. Now we'll provide an overview of how you can achieve a remote debug connection using RTX64 Runtime, RTX64 SDK, and Visual Studio. RTX64 also supports a remote debug environment, where the Visual Studio IDE resides on the development system and the process to be debugged resides on a target system on the local network. On the target system, install and configure the Visual Studio remote tools so the host system can connect over the network using Visual Studio. Then configure remote debugging through the RTX64 control panel. You must also make sure the RTX64 subsystem is running. On the host system, you need to launch the version of Visual Studio that is compatible with the Visual Studio Remote Debugger on the target system. When the RTX64 Remote Debugger feature is installed, you can allow new remote connections and configure those connections through the Configure Remote Debugging screen in the RTX64 control panel. The control panel also detects whether supported Visual Studio remote tools are configured for remote launch and attach, and displays their current status. Once you have set up a remote debug environment, you can launch a remote real-time process from Visual Studio and debug using the Visual Studio IDE or attach the Visual Studio debugger to an RTSS process on a remote system, outside of the Visual Studio IDE. See the RTX64 SDK help for more information on setting up a remote debug connection and attaching to an RTSS process on the target system. This concludes our overview video on RTX64 debugging options. For more information, see the documentation installed with the product and available online, and check out our other product videos available from interval0.com and YouTube. Thanks for watching!